In 1998, a hotel executive walked into a boardroom with a proposal that sounded almost too simple to matter. Strip out the patterned bedspreads, strip out the colored duvets, strip out the busy floral comforters that had defined hotel rooms for the previous 4 decades. Replace all of it in every property, in every market, on every continent with the same thing: white sheets, white duvet, white pillows stacked in a specific layered configuration. The board thought it sounded like a minor cosmetic update. It turned out to be one of the most quietly influential design decisions in the entire history of the hospitality industry. And it's the reason that today, whether you're staying in a budget motel off a highway or a 5-star resort overlooking the ocean, the bed underneath you is almost certainly, overwhelmingly, aggressively white. Here's the thing: nobody tells you when you're lying in that bed, scrolling through your phone at midnight, comfortable, half asleep, not thinking about any of this at all. That whiteness is not a design trend. It's not an aesthetic accident. It's not even really about looking clean, even though that's the story we've all been told for 25 years. The color of that bed is the output of a cold, deliberate cost equation that runs through nearly every major hotel chain on the planet. An equation involving industrial laundering chemistry, brand psychology, hygiene liability law, and a financial calculation about exactly how much guests are willing to pay extra for the appearance of purity. Once you understand the actual mechanism behind it, you will never look at a hotel bed the same way again. So here's what we're doing today. I'm going to show you the real history of how white bedding became the near universal global standard in an industry that used to be defined by color and pattern. We'll break down the specific chemical and financial reason white sheets are actually cheaper for hotels to maintain than colored ones, which sounds backward until you see the math. I'll explain the psychological research the hospitality industry has quietly used for decades to convince you that white equals clean. Even though, and this is the part that's going to bother you, white sheets are frequently not the cleanest option in the room. And I'll walk you through exactly what's happening to that bedding between the moment you check out and the moment the next guest checks in, because the answer is not what most people assume. This isn't about hating on hotels, it's about understanding the actual mechanical system sitting underneath something you've probably slept on 100 times without ever once questioning why it looks the way it does. Here's the concept worth holding onto for the rest of this video. Think of a hotel bed the way you'd think of a restaurant's plating. A chef doesn't put food on a white plate because white is the chef's favorite color. White is chosen because it is the single most effective neutral background for making anything placed on top of it look more vivid, more intentional, more premium. A red sauce looks richer on white. A green herb garnish looks brighter on white. The plate disappears and the food becomes the entire visual event. Hotel bedding works on almost the exact same principle, except the food being presented isn't a meal, it's an emotional state. The state of arriving somewhere unfamiliar, tired, possibly stressed from travel and needing, immediately and without having to think about it, visual proof that the space is safe and sanitary. White does that job faster and more completely than any other color, and the hospitality industry figured this out with startling precision. The actual history isn't as old as most people assume. Through most of the 20th century, hotel bedding followed local taste, which meant it was wildly inconsistent. Mid-century American motels leaned toward bold patterned bedspreads, florals, plaids, sometimes genuinely loud color combinations that read as cheerful rather than clean. European hotels of the same era often used heavier, darker fabrics, partly for practicality, partly because darker fabric hid stains and wear far longer between deep cleanings, which mattered enormously in an era before industrial laundering was cheap and fast. A dark burgundy bedspread could go months without a professional wash and nobody would notice a coffee stain. That was, for a long time, considered a feature, not a flaw. Then two things happened roughly at the same time in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and together they completely rewired the industry. The first was a specific, well-documented business decision made by a major American hotel chain, widely credited as the first large-scale adopter of what the industry now calls the white bed or cloud bed concept, layering multiple white components, a duvet cover, a flat sheet, and stacked pillows into a single uniform white presentation. The chain's own internal research at the time found something the whole industry would later confirm independently. Guests consistently rated rooms with all white bedding as feeling cleaner, more luxurious, and more expensive than the exact same room with colored or patterned bedding, even when the actual thread count, fabric quality, and price point were identical. Read that carefully. Nothing about the actual physical quality of the bed changed, only the color changed, and guest perception of luxury and cleanliness jumped measurably. That single finding is arguably the most important piece of data in the modern hotel industry's entire approach to guest rooms, and it quietly became doctrine across the whole sector within about a decade. The second thing that happened was industrial. Around the same period, commercial laundry facilities serving the hotel industry began scaling up their use of chlorine-based bleach and high-heat industrial washing as the default sanitation method for hotel linens, largely driven by rising liability concerns around bedbugs, bodily fluids, and general hygiene lawsuits that had started to hit the industry hard. And here's where the financial mechanism kicks in, the part almost nobody outside the industry ever learns. Chlorine bleach is devastating to colored and patterned fabric. It strips dye, fades pattern, and destroys colored textiles within a relatively small number of wash cycles. Sometimes as few as 20 to 30 industrial washes before a colored sheet looks visibly faded and has to be pulled from rotation. White fabric, by contrast, actually improves with chlorine bleach exposure over repeated washes. Because bleach doesn't just clean white fabric, it optically whitens it further, meaning the harshest, cheapest, fastest sanitation method available to a commercial laundry operation is simultaneously the method that extends the usable lifespan of white bedding while actively destroying colored bedding. Think about what that means from a pure operation standpoint. A hotel that uses colored bedspreads has to either use gentler, more expensive detergents and lower wash temperatures to protect the color, which raises sanitation risk and slows the laundry cycle, or accept a dramatically shorter replacement cycle, meaning buying new bedspreads far more often. A hotel that uses white bedding can run the harshest, cheapest, most aggressive sanitation cycle available on every single changeover, with zero concern about fading, and get a longer usable lifespan out of each set of linens. White wasn't just chosen because it looked luxurious. White was chosen because it happened to be the exact color that survives, and even benefits from, the cheapest possible industrial cleaning process. The luxury branding came second. The cost math came first. Here's the metaphor I want you to sit with for a moment. Picture a company that makes work uniforms. If every employee could show up in whatever color shirt they wanted, the laundry service handling those uniforms would need dozens of separate wash settings, separate detergents, separate cycles, to avoid bleeding dye between garments and to protect each individual color. But if the company mandates that every single uniform is plain white, the laundry service can run one wash setting, one detergent, one aggressive bleach cycle for every single garment, every single day, at massive scale, with zero risk of ruining anything. Hotel bedding is that uniform policy, applied at a global industrial scale across an entire multi-billion-dollar hospitality sector. Standardization isn't a design choice made for your comfort. It's an operations choice made for laundering efficiency. And the fact that it also happens to look clean and expensive to the average guest is a secondary benefit. The industry was more than happy to lean into once they noticed it. The psychology is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, and it's the part hotels are least eager to discuss openly. White has become such a powerful visual shorthand for cleanliness in the hospitality industry that multiple studies on guest perception have found travelers routinely rate white bedding as cleaner or more sanitary, even in blind comparisons, where the actual bacterial or cleanliness testing shows no meaningful difference, and in some documented cases shows the white bedding was objectively less clean, having simply been laundered with a process that visually masked staining rather than a process that more thoroughly removed contaminants. In other words, the color white is doing psychological work that has, in a meaningful number of documented cases, outpaced the actual hygiene reality underneath it. You are not evaluating cleanliness when you look at a white hotel bed. You are evaluating a color, and your brain is doing the rest of the work for the hotel for free based on a visual association the industry spent 2.5 decades deliberately reinforcing. The layering trick specifically is one of the more clever pieces of the whole system, and it's almost purely psychological rather than functional. That thick stack you sink into on a hotel bed, a duvet, then a decorative white runner or extra folded blanket, then a wall of stacked pillows is not primarily there for your comfort. Hospitality design consultants refer to this as bed architecture, and it's engineered specifically to create visual height and volume, because a taller, fuller-looking bed reads to the human eye as more luxurious, more generous, more expensive, independent of how it actually feels to sleep in. Most guests never actually use more than one or two of those pillows. The rest are purely staged, arranged the same way a real estate stager arranges a model home to be photographed and glanced at, not necessarily to be functionally used. Housekeeping in most large hotel chains is trained on an exact, standardized pillow and layering sequence, sometimes down to the specific fold and tuck pattern of the top sheet, precisely because the visual presentation has been identified through years of guest satisfaction data as one of the single strongest drivers of a guest's overall satisfaction score for the entire room, often outweighing factors like mattress firmness or room size in guest surveys. The actual math on what this system costs and who benefits from it is genuinely eye-opening. Industrial white bedding sets, at the volume major hotel chains purchase them, are dramatically cheaper per unit than premium colored or patterned alternatives would be, both because white cotton polyester blends are a commodity product manufactured at enormous global scale with intense price competition between suppliers, and because the standardized nature of white bedding means a single hotel chain can negotiate one massive global supply contract instead of dozens of regional, color-specific contracts. A large hotel chain operating tens of thousands of rooms across multiple countries can save meaningful sums annually simply by never having to manage inventory complexity around color variation, seasonal pattern changes, or regional design preferences. Multiply that operational simplicity across a chain with hundreds of thousands of rooms worldwide, and you're looking at a genuinely significant recurring cost advantage layered on top of the extended linen lifespan advantage from being able to bleach aggressively without fading concerns. White bedding isn't just cheaper to buy, it's cheaper to clean, cheaper to replace, and cheaper to manage at scale, and none of those three cost advantages have anything to do with what actually makes you sleep better. Here's a concrete example to make this real. Picture a woman named Elena who manages procurement for a mid-sized hotel group with around 40 properties. A few years into the job, she ran an internal cost comparison between the chain's standard white bedding program and a proposed switch to a signature colored bedding line. One of the group's boutique properties wanted to introduce as a way to feel more distinct from the rest of the chain. The colored bedding, once she factored in gentler required detergents, lower wash temperatures needed to protect the dye, a shortened replacement cycle because of fading, and the loss of bulk purchasing leverage from breaking away from the standardized white supply contract, came out to costing the property roughly 40% more per room per year to maintain than the standard white program. For bedding that, in guest satisfaction surveys, actually scored slightly lower on perceived cleanliness than the plain white rooms elsewhere in the chain. The boutique property's colored bedding experiment lasted about 18 months before it was quietly phased back to white. Elena told colleagues afterward that the numbers made the decision for her. It wasn't really a design conversation at all. It was a laundry chemistry and procurement conversation wearing a design conversation's clothes. There's a detail almost nobody clocks consciously, but every frequent traveler has absorbed subconsciously. The specific shade of white varies more than you'd think, and hotels have gotten remarkably scientific about which exact tone of white to use. There's a meaningful difference between a stark, slightly blue-tone white, the kind you'll often see in higher-end business hotels, and a warmer, cream-adjacent white, more common in resort and leisure properties. This isn't random either. Color psychology research commissioned by major chains has found that guests associate cooler, blue-toned white with efficiency, precision, and business-appropriate cleanliness, the kind of white you'd expect in a hospital or a lab, while warmer whites read as cozy, relaxed, and vacation-appropriate. A business hotel chain and a beachfront resort chain might both be using white bedding, but they're frequently sourcing fabric dyed, or rather bleached and finished, to hit subtly different target shades on a color wheel, chosen deliberately to match the emotional register the brand is trying to sell you before you've even had a single conversation with staff. The color isn't just white, it's a very specific, focus-grouped white, tuned to the exact emotional promise of that particular chain. There's also a manufacturing side to this worth understanding because it explains why the shift happened as fast as it did once the first major chain proved the model worked. Textile manufacturers supplying the hospitality industry realized quickly that standardizing around white meant they could run enormous, continuous production batches of a single undyed or lightly processed product, rather than smaller, more expensive runs of specific dye lots that had to be color matched precisely across different manufacturing batches to avoid visible mismatches between, say, a duvet cover from one shipment and pillowcases from another. Dye matching across large industrial batches is a genuinely difficult and costly manufacturing problem, prone to small variations that become visually obvious once you put pieces from different production runs side by side on the same bed. White sidesteps that problem almost entirely. This meant textile suppliers could offer hotel chains significantly better per unit pricing on white goods than on any colored equivalent, simply because the manufacturing process itself became more efficient and more forgiving at scale. So the incentive to standardize on white wasn't only coming from the hotel side of the relationship. It was being reinforced from the supplier side too, with better pricing available specifically for chains willing to commit to enormous uniform white orders instead of smaller, customized, colored runs. There's a concrete example on the manufacturing side too, and the numbers are surprisingly stark once you see them laid out. A regional hotel group that supplies its own laundering rather than outsourcing to a third-party commercial laundry ran an internal audit a few years back comparing the average lifespan of a white duvet cover versus a colored one under identical wash frequency. Roughly one wash per guest stay across a high turnover property. The white covers lasted, on average, close to double the number of wash cycles before visible wear. Thinning or graying required replacement compared to the colored covers, which showed visible fading and dye migration issues within a much smaller number of cycles even when washed with objectively gentler settings specifically chosen to protect the color. Replacement cost per cover wasn't dramatically different at the point of purchase, but replacement frequency was, and when you multiply that difference across thousands of rooms and multiple wash cycles per week, the annual cost gap becomes significant enough to show up clearly in a procurement department's budget, not as a rounding error, but as a genuine line item worth optimizing. There's a supplementary detail here that a lot of guests never think to ask about. Why hotels almost universally choose cotton polyester blends rather than pure cotton for their white bedding, given that pure cotton is often marketed to consumers as the more premium, more breathable choice. The answer, again, comes back to industrial laundering economics rather than comfort. Pure cotton, while soft and breathable, wrinkles more easily, shrinks more over repeated high-heat industrial washes, and generally has a shorter usable lifespan under commercial laundering conditions than a cotton polyester blend, which resists wrinkling, holds its shape and size through hundreds of wash cycles, and dries faster in industrial dryers, which itself saves meaningful energy costs at scale. Higher-end hotels will often use a higher cotton percentage blend, sometimes marketed with a specific thread count number prominently displayed as a mark of luxury, while budget and mid-scale properties lean toward blends with a higher polyester content purely for durability and cost reasons. The thread count number itself, by the way, is a genuinely useful indicator of fabric quality up to a point, but past a certain threshold, roughly the 300 to 400 range, additional thread count delivers rapidly diminishing comfort returns while adding meaningfully to cost, which is exactly why you'll see some hotel marketing materials proudly advertising thread counts well above that range, banking on the number sounding impressive to guests who have no independent way of judging what the number actually means for how the sheet will feel. The hygiene liability piece is another layer most guests never think about, and it explains why white bedding became almost mandatory rather than merely popular in a lot of major chains starting in the mid-2000s. As bedbug infestation lawsuits and general hygiene-related legal claims against hotels increased sharply in the early 2000s, hotel legal and risk departments began pushing hard for bedding that made visual inspection easier, both for housekeeping staff doing routine checks and for the hotel's own liability defense in the event of a dispute. A dark patterned comforter can hide a bedbug, a bloodstain, or visible soiling for weeks. A plain white sheet cannot hide anything. Every mark shows immediately, which means housekeeping staff can spot problems faster, and just as importantly from a legal standpoint, the hotel can demonstrate, if it ever needs to in court, that its bedding is inspected and laundered in a way that would have caught contamination had it existed. White bedding isn't just a marketing choice. It became, quietly, a risk management tool, adopted industry-wide, partly because insurance underwriters and hotel liability consultants began recommending it as a defensible standard. Once major chains started requiring it as company policy for legal reasons, Independent hotels and smaller chains followed almost automatically, both to match guest expectations that had been trained by the bigger chains and because deviating from the emerging standard started to look, to insurers, like an unnecessary risk. What actually happens to that bedding between guests is more mechanical and honestly a bit less glamorous than most travelers imagine. In a well run major chain, sheets and pillowcases are, by policy, replaced and laundered after every single guest checkout, without exception, largely because of the liability concerns just described. Duvet covers are typically also changed after every stay in most upper tier chains. The duvet insert itself, the actual thick filled layer underneath the cover, is generally not washed after every guest, but is instead laundered on a periodic schedule, sometimes only a few times a year, since it's fully enclosed inside a freshly laundered cover each time, and rarely comes into direct contact with a guest's skin. This is standard, disclosed, industry practice, not a secret scandal, but it is something almost no guest ever thinks about while admiring how crisp and white everything looks, because the entire visual system was built specifically to communicate total freshness regardless of what's actually happening one layer beneath the surface you can see. Here's the part that ties the whole system together, and it's worth naming directly because it explains why this became a genuinely global standard rather than a regional American quirk. Once the largest hotel chains proved that white bedding simultaneously lowered operating costs and raised guest satisfaction scores, independent hotels and regional chains everywhere faced enormous competitive pressure to match it. Because guests, having been trained by years of exposure to the big chains, began unconsciously using white bedding as a baseline expectation for what a clean, professional hotel room should look like. A boutique hotel that kept colorful, patterned bedding into the 2010s wasn't just making a design choice anymore. It was risking guests unconsciously rating the property as less clean or less professional than a competitor down the street with plain white sheets, regardless of the property's actual cleanliness standards. The color white had stopped being one design option among many. It had become the invisible passing grade every hotel needed to meet just to be perceived as competent. And once an entire industry converges on the same passing grade, virtually nobody has the incentive to be the outlier. Widening the lens for a moment, this pattern isn't actually unique to hotels. It's a specific instance of a much broader principle in commercial design. And once you see it here, you'll start noticing it in other industries too. Anytime an industry discovers that a single visual cue can substitute for an expensive, hard to verify quality, hygiene, freshness, safety, craftsmanship, that industry will very quickly standardize around whatever version of that cue is cheapest to produce at scale, even if the cue only loosely correlates with the underlying quality it's meant to represent. White bedding communicates cleanliness far faster than an actual line-by-line hygiene report ever could, and communicates it to guests who have no practical way of independently verifying real sanitation standards anyway. Restaurants do a version of this with open kitchens, letting you visually confirm cleanliness rather than trusting a health inspection score you'll never actually read. Grocery stores do it with bright lighting over produce sections, specifically calibrated to make fruits and vegetables look fresher and more vivid than they'd appear under neutral light. Airlines do it with the smell they pipe into cabins on certain premium routes, a specific manufactured scent correlated in guest research with freshness, despite having nothing to do with actual air quality. In every one of these cases, the industry has learned that managing your perception of a quality is dramatically cheaper and faster than actually maximizing that quality. And once that lesson is learned once, inside one company, in one boardroom, it tends to spread across an entire sector within a matter of years, because the first movers' guest satisfaction scores become impossible for competitors to ignore. It's worth pausing on why this particular kind of signal, a simple, easily replicated visual cue, spreads so much faster than genuine quality improvements do. A real quality improvement, a better mattress core, better sound insulation, better water pressure requires capital investment, physical renovation, and time, often years, to roll out across an entire chain of properties. A color change requires a single decision at headquarters and a new supply contract. The asymmetry is enormous. This is precisely why the hospitality industry, faced with a genuine and expensive challenge, guests can't easily verify real hygiene standards, gravitated so completely toward the cheap, fast solution, a visual signal, rather than the expensive, slow solution. Verifiably better cleaning outcomes communicated through something guests could actually check. It's not that hotels are uniquely deceptive, it's that the economics of signal versus substance almost always favor the signal in any industry whenever a genuine underlying quality is hard for the customer to directly verify in the moment of purchase. So here's the protocol, the actual practical takeaway for anyone who wants to travel a little more clear-eyed about what they're looking at. First, stop using whiteness itself as a proxy for how clean a room actually is. It's a genuinely unreliable signal, not because hotels are lying to you outright, but because the color was optimized for laundering economics and psychological perception long before it was optimized as an honest indicator of hygiene. If cleanliness is a real concern for you, particularly around bedbugs, the more useful check is a quick visual inspection of the mattress seams and headboard area, not the color of the sheets on top. Second, understand that the layered cloud bed look you're sinking into is largely staged. You don't need to feel obligated to use every pillow on the bed, and you shouldn't judge a hotel's actual quality primarily by how tall and voluminous the bedding presentation looks, since that presentation is one of the most heavily engineered, lowest cost per unit of perceived luxury elements in the entire room. Third, if you're ever comparing two similarly priced hotels and trying to judge real quality, look past the bedding entirely and toward details that are genuinely harder and more expensive to fake: actual mattress firmness and support, real sound insulation between rooms, water pressure in the shower. These are functional quality signals that require real investment to get right, unlike a color scheme that can be replicated by any budget property with a single bulk linen order. Fourth, if you're someone who travels frequently and cares about sleep quality specifically, know that the visual whiteness of a bed has essentially zero correlation with how well you'll actually sleep on it. A budget motel with a genuinely supportive mattress under plain white sheets will very often give you better rest than a luxury branded property whose real investment went almost entirely into the visual staging of the room rather than the mattress hardware underneath it. Fifth, if a hotel's marketing leans heavily on a specific thread count number, treat it the way you'd treat any isolated marketing statistic, worth noting, but not worth paying a large premium for on its own. Past the few hundred range, additional thread count buys you very little in actual comfort, and a genuinely good mattress with a modest, honest thread count will almost always beat a mediocre mattress dressed up with an impressive sounding fabric statistic. Here's the identity level takeaway I want to leave you with. Every white hotel bed you've ever slept in was not designed primarily around your comfort. And it wasn't really designed around cleanliness either, not in the way the industry wants you to assume. It was designed around a specific, quietly brilliant cost equation, one where the cheapest possible industrial sanitation process happened to also be the process that produces the strongest psychological impression of luxury and hygiene. And once the hospitality industry discovered that equation in the late 1990s, it spread across the entire global sector within about 2 decades. Not because every hotel independently decided white looked best, but because white was, almost accidentally, the single most profitable color a bed could be. None of this means hotels are secretly dirty or that you should start distrusting every property you stay at. Most major chains genuinely do maintain rigorous laundering standards, and the liability pressures that push the industry toward white bedding in the first place have, in a real sense, made hygiene practices more consistent and more inspectable across the industry than they were in the era of dark, stain-hiding bedspreads. But it's worth knowing the next time you walk into a hotel room and feel that immediate sense of crisp, clean calm looking at the bed, that the feeling itself was manufactured deliberately over decades by people running spreadsheets about bleach tolerance and linen replacement cycles, long before anyone in that boardroom was thinking about how the room would make you feel. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. Hotel bedding turned white primarily because white fabric survives and even benefits from the cheapest, harshest industrial bleaching process available, giving hotels a direct cost and durability advantage that colored bedding simply cannot match at commercial laundering scale. 2. The industry discovered through direct guest research in the late 1990s and early 2000s that white bedding raises perceived cleanliness and perceived luxury, independent of actual quality. And once that discovery spread, matching it became a competitive necessity for every hotel trying to be taken seriously, regardless of size or price point. 3. The whole system, the layered pillows, the crisp duvet, the bright white presentation is a piece of engineered visual communication, not a reliable indicator of real hygiene or comfort, and knowing that changes what you should actually be looking at the next time you're deciding which hotel is worth your money. Next time you check into a room and drop your bag by a bed that looks like a cloud, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not a design choice made for you. A cost equation, dressed in white, that happened to make you feel something valuable enough that nobody in the industry has ever had a real incentive to change it back.